Some homes are sitting for months right now, and most sellers have no idea why. And the dangerous part is, a lot of them think it's the market. But two homes can hit the market on the same day, in the same neighborhood, at almost the same price, and one sells immediately while others sit. That's not random. And right now, that difference matters more than people realize, because the market has changed. Buyers have changed. And what actually makes a home competitive today is very different from what a few years ago. Even in slower markets, some properties still move quickly. And even in strong markets, some homes sit quietly while sellers continue wondering why nobody is making an offer. So the real question becomes, what separates the properties that move from the ones that stall out? Because right now there's a lot of confusion in the market. Interest rates are higher than what most consumers became used to over the past several years. Buyers are much more payment sensitive, and sellers are still emotionally attached to pricing expectations from a completely different market environment. We're not in COVID anymore. There's not a gold rush for homes. Buyers are hesitating longer, comparing more properties, and analyzing decisions much more carefully than they were when everything was moving fast. That changes the way homes need to be positioned. One of the biggest mistakes people are making right now is assuming that if a home isn't selling, the market itself must be weak. That's not always true. Sometimes the market is actually speaking very clearly, and the seller simply isn't listening to it. And one of the clearest indicators of that is days on market. Days on market tells you far more than whether a property sold quickly. It tells you how the market is responding to the property. And those are two completely different things. For a long time, homes could hit the market overpriced, underprepared, poorly marketed, and still move because demand was aggressive enough to absorb mistakes. That environment covered a lot of weak strategy. That environment is gone. Now buyers are more selective. They're more analytical. They're comparing value much more aggressively because monthly payments matter more than they used to. That's what higher rates really changed. People talk about rates strictly from an affordability standpoint, but rates change consumer psychology just as much as they changed payments. When monthly payments increase, buyers become far more sensitive to value, condition, presentation, and pricing. They start asking harder questions because the cost of making a mistake feels higher. And that's where positioning becomes incredibly important. Most sellers still think in terms of what they want the home to be worth. The market doesn't care what someone wants the home to be worth. The market responds to perceived value, and perceived value is created through pricing, presentation, condition, marketing, timing, and competition, not emotion. One of the biggest mistakes sellers make right now is overpricing at the beginning because they think, I can always reduce the price later. We can always go down, but we can't go up. That sounds logical. That sounds real logical on paper. But the first few days on market are usually the strongest visibility window that a listing gets. That's when buyers are paying the most attention. That's when agents are watching it. That's when activity is the highest. That first week on market is one of the most important weeks of a listing's life. And if the property misses the market during that initial window, the listing can start developing resistance around it. Buyers begin asking questions. Why hasn't it sold? What's wrong with it? Is the seller being unrealistic? Can I negotiate harder? That's a big one, and I hear that a lot. Oh, it's been on the market for a while. They're getting desperate. Just went through that with a couple of clients recently. Didn't matter. Didn't matter to the seller at all. But you know what? That shift matters because once leverage starts moving away from the seller, it becomes much harder to regain control of the positioning. Presentation also matters far more than many sellers realize because real estate has become extremely digital. Buyers usually experience a property online before they ever physically walk through it, which means photography, lighting, staging, and cleanliness matter a lot more than they used to. The first impression is no longer the driveway. It's your phone screen. And buyers make emotional decisions before they justify them logically. That's true in almost every form of sales, and real estate is definitely no different. If the property doesn't create immediate interest online, people keep scrolling. I do it. Almost every person I know does. Once they scroll past it, getting them back is much harder than most sellers realize. That's why some homes sell immediately. They enter the market correctly. The pricing aligns with buyer psychology, the presentation aligns with consumer expectations, and the marketing creates enough attention to make it a property feel competitive within the current environment, not last year's environment. That distinction matters because the market has changed, consumer behavior has changed, and buyer expectations, they've tremendously changed. People are more cautious right now. They're comparing more homes, evaluating monthly payments more, and becoming much more aware of the difference between price and value, especially in markets where inventory is increasing. And although inventory is increasing, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily in a buyer or seller market. That's a completely different topic. But when inventory rises, buyers do gain options. And when buyers gain options, average properties become much easier to ignore. This is also where sellers misunderstand upgrades. Not every dollar spent improving a home creates equal value. Some improvements dramatically improve positioning, while others barely move the needle. Sometimes the issue isn't even the property itself. Sometimes it's simply the way the property is being positioned against competing inventory. That's where strategy matters. And strategy matters much more than it did when everything was selling automatically. We're not getting 30, 40, 50 offers in 24 hours anymore. And one thing sellers need to understand is that positioning a home correctly is no longer just about putting a sign in the yard and waiting and hoping and praying for activity. The homes performing the best right now are usually the homes where the seller understood the buyer before the property ever hit the market. That means understanding who the likely buyer is, what matters to them, and what competing inventory looks like, what price range buyers are emotionally comfortable in, and how the property needs to present itself online to create urgency. Because urgency is what creates leverage. And leverage is what creates stronger outcomes. A lot of sellers still think the strategy is simply to price high and negotiate down. That worked better when inventory was tighter and rates were lower. Today, overpricing often kills momentum before the property ever has a chance to build it. Momentum matters. When a listing enters the market correctly, activity creates perception. Perception creates competition. And as we all know, competition creates leverage. That's the cycle sellers want. But when a listing enters overpriced, poorly presented, or disconnected from current buyer expectations, the opposite starts happening. Activity slows. Buyers hesitate, and the listing ages. and the seller starts reacting instead of leading. That's where negotiations usually weaken. This is where buyers start critiquing properties much more. And this is where preparation matters more than most people realize. Sometimes small improvements create outsized results. Paint, lighting, landscaping, decluttering, furniture positioning, updated fixtures, even simply improving the way natural light photographs can dramatically change buyer perception online. And perception drives traffic. Traffic drives opportunity, but not every upgrade creates value. That's another area people misunderstand. I see sellers spend significant amounts of money on improvements that buyers either don't care about or don't value enough to justify the cost. The strongest strategy is usually not making the property the most expensive option. It's making it feel like the strongest value within a competitive landscape. That's a completely different approach. And buyers need strategy too, because right now there's a lot of hesitation in the market. There's a lot of uncertainty. Some buyers are waiting for rates to drop. Some are waiting for prices to fall. Not seeing a lot of that. We've seen a little price improvement, but not a lot. Some are waiting for certainty. And in the years I've been doing this, certainty is usually very hard to come by. The problem with certainty usually arrives after opportunity changes. And that's why buyers have to focus less on perfectly timing the market and more on understanding their positioning. Can the payment work comfortably? Does the property fit long-term goals? Is there room for negotiation? How competitive is the market? How long has the property been sitting? Is the seller becoming more flexible? Those questions matter much more than trying to predict the exact future of rates 6 months from now. Because smart buyers understand something important. Not every opportunity looks obvious at first. Sometimes the best opportunities are the properties where emotion has already left the negotiation. The seller's tired. The listing has slowed down. The leverage has shifted. That's where preparation starts becoming powerful. And this is why interpreting the market correctly matters so much more. Because headlines rarely tell the full story. People want broad statements like the market is crashing, the market is booming, but the reality is almost always more nuanced than that. Different price points behave differently. Different property types behave differently. And different locations certainly behave much differently. The details matter. And one of the cleanest details right now is this. The properties winning in today's environment are usually the ones positioned correctly from the beginning, not the ones chasing the market after the fact. That's a major difference. Reactive sellers usually lose leverage. Strategic sellers create it. The same applies to buyers. The strongest buyers right now are not necessarily the emotional buyers. They're the most prepared. They understand their numbers, understand affordability, understand negotiation, and understand that uncertainty exists in every market. There is no perfect moment. There is no perfect interest rate. There is no perfectly predictable market. There are only better positioned decisions. And that's really what this episode comes down to. the market is becoming less forgiving. That doesn't mean that the opportunity is gone. It means that strategy matters more, pricing matters more, presentation matters more. Negotiations and positioning are much more important, and they matter more, because homes don't sit because the market is weak. Some homes sit because they miss the market. And there's a very important difference between those two things.